It's almost fall, and it's time to think about planting those spring bulbs. So I thought I'd make this program, Myths About Spring Bulbs. Probably the biggest myth of all is the use of bone meal. For some reason, people have this belief that they need to use bone meal whenever they plant bulbs. It's not true. Bone meal adds phosphate and calcium, and both of those nutrients are found in most soils, at least in North America. Unless you have a deficiency of either one of those, don't add bone meal. The second reason you don't want to add bone meal is that it tends to attract animals, particularly rodents like squirrels. And dogs go crazy over this stuff. So if you want things digging up your bulbs, go ahead and use bone meal. Now, once your bulbs are finished in the spring, the flowers are done. A lot of people want to cut those things back, and that's a really bad idea. Those leaves need to photosynthesize. They're making the food for next year's flowers. If you cut the leaves off, you'll get less or smaller flowers next year. Now, if you want to learn about how plants actually grow, have a look at my book, Plant Science for Gardeners. There's a whole section in there about bulbs. All right, so the bulbs finish flowering. What should you do? Some people braid the leaves. Other people tie them in a knot. Well, those are almost as bad as cutting them off. If the sun can't get to the surface of all the leaves, you're reducing photosynthesis. It's as simple as that. The best thing to do is just leave the leaves alone. The plant tells you when it's finished with those leaves. They'll start going yellow. Once you see that, go ahead and cut them off. Now, some people say, well, leave them for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and that probably works. You're not going to kill the plant if you cut them off at that point. But understand that if the leaves are still green, the plant's using the leaves. Don't cut them off. So squirrels are a big problem for spring bulbs. You go out, you plant them, squirrels come along and dig them up. So how do you stop the squirrels? Well, to understand this, we have to understand the psychology of squirrels. There are two kinds of squirrels. There's the ambitious squirrel. They go out and they dig up those bulbs. And then there's a group of squirrels, the lazy squirrels. They just sit around and they watch the other squirrels. And when that other squirrel digs a hole and buries something, the lazy squirrel goes over and digs it up. I mean, that's easier than gathering your own food. Now that sounds like kind of a funny story, but it's actually kind of true. There are squirrels who mostly steal food and let their friends gather it. What squirrels are really looking for is a place where the soil was dug. Now, I did an experiment a few years ago. I took a bunch of tulip bulbs and I spread them out on the lawn in an area that a lot of squirrels cross to get from the trees to my bird feeder. I wanted to see how quickly these tulip bulbs disappeared. After all, if squirrels really like tulip bulbs, you'd think that they'd find them in an afternoon and they'd all be gone. And I had marked the location, so every day I went out and counted the tulip bulbs to see if they were still there. It took a whole week for the squirrels to find these bulbs, and these were sitting above ground where they could easily smell them. The other thing I noticed was that the bulbs were half eaten. The squirrels actually came along, they found the bulbs, they started chewing on them. They didn't like them, so they threw them away. I learned two things about that. One is that squirrels really can't smell these bulbs very well. The second is they don't even like tulip bulbs. So why are they digging up your tulips? Well, squirrels look for areas in the soil that have been dug, because that means someone's buried something. It looks as if other squirrels have buried their nuts there. So they dig and they find bulbs. So the trick is to prevent them from digging in those spots. And there's two things you can do. The one thing you can do is just cover the area with chicken wire. That keeps them from digging. But that's a lot of work. And by the way, you don't have to take the chicken wire off in the spring. The bulbs will grow right through the holes. What I prefer to do is that once I've buried my bulbs, I pat down the soil very hard. And then I put mulch back. So when you look at the garden, it doesn't look as if anyone's planted anything. And if you do that, most of your bulbs will be fine. The other thing I do is I tend to grow bulbs that are toxic to animals. And so I like the daffodils. Nobody digs those up and eats them. Tulips, things will come and eat them. My problem is in the spring I have deer that come through and they'll just eat all the flowers off the top. It's a bigger problem than my squirrels. And that's why I stay away from tulips, and I tend to grow daffodils that everything leaves alone. In the middle of summer, once my daffodils were finished flowering, I dug up a whole bunch of extra bulbs. Now, normally you should plant these right away. If you dig them up in your garden, middle of summer, don't store them in the shed. Just plant them right away. The problem I had was I wasn't ready to plant them yet. So most bulbs will do just fine if you store them dry. It's fall now, and it's time to plant these guys. So when should you plant them? I see a lot of people suggesting that you wait until there's frost on the ground. For some reason, people think the ground has to be cold before you plant these bulbs. What about the bulbs from last year? The ones you planted last year, the year before that. They're all in the ground all summer long. They don't wait for frost. There's no reason for you to wait till frost. In fact, the sooner you plant them, the better. These bulbs start making roots in late summer and early fall. So the sooner you get them in the ground, the better the bulbs will grow. So don't wait till frost. Another rule of planting these is always to make sure that they're the right way up. Now these are daffodils, and they're really easy to tell. I mean, this end has roots on it, and end is pointy, so you know which way is up. But that's not true for all bulbs. So what happens if you plant these upside down? Well, they grow just fine. And in fact, I tested that myself. I took a pot, took several daffodils, planted some this way, some upside down, in the same pot, and I didn't mark them, so I didn't know which was which. Then I let that pot sit over the winter and waited till next spring to see what happened. And I tried to identify the ones that were planted the right way up because I assumed they would have better, larger leaves, better flowers. Turns out the ones that were upside down actually did a little bit better. But that wasn't statistically significant. I left the pot for another year, dug them up. Guess what? They're all pointing the right way up. Bulbs know which way is up and which way is down, and it doesn't matter which way you plant them. They'll sort it out, they'll grow correctly, and they'll actually turn around. Next thing you have to know is how deep do you plant these? Well, the rule of thumb is to measure the height and then plant them 2 to 3 times that depth. So let's say you want about 5-6 inches for this daffodil. Is that measurement from the top of the soil to the bottom of the hole, or the top of the soil to the top of the bulb? Nobody ever says. Well, it turns out it's the distance to the bottom of the hole. So that rule of 2 to 3 times, that is the size of the hole you dig. If you want to plant the bulb at 5 inches, dig the hole at 5 inches. Now, how important is that depth? Well, it turns out, again, bulbs are smarter than we think. And by smart, I don't mean any kind of intelligence. They're just biologically programmed to know what to do. So many of these bulbs develop what they call contractile roots. They're special roots that can pull the bulb deeper. So if you plant this bulb too deep, it will actually move up over time. If you plant it too shallow, it'll move down over time. And its preferred depth depends on the type of soil you have. In sandy soil, they'll tend to be deeper. In heavy clay soil, they'll tend to be more shallow. If you plant muscari, you can plant them 3 inches deep. In a couple years, they're all about 1 inch deep because they like being right under the surface, at least in my soil. These guys I plant at about 5 inches. And when I go and dig these up 5-6 years later, they're all down around 10 inches. That's where they like to be in my soil. So the depth isn't really that important. See how easy it is to plant bulbs? You can pretty much throw them in the ground and they'll figure it out. Well, I just found a bee in my bulb basket. A lot of people like spring bulbs because they're sort of a bury and forget type of plant. But that's not entirely true. Most of these bulbs you can bury and forget, at least for a few years. But you'll find that after 5-7 years, they make babies and the hole gets too crowded. There are too many bulbs in this hole. And so it's a good idea to come along about every 7 years, dig them up, split them, and move them. This whole pail of bulbs came out of 2 planting holes that I had planted about 10 years ago. I don't know how many bulbs are in there, but I've got lots for about 7 holes. The way I plant these, I like digging a hole, and then I throw in as many bulbs as seem reasonable. In a hole this size, I'll probably put in about 8 bulbs. 6 years from now, I can dig them up and I'll have 25 bulbs. So when do you dig them up? Well, listen to your plants. They'll tell you. If you have a clump of spring blooming bulbs and the flower quality starts going down or the number of flowers goes down, they're too crowded. If you see the leaves coming up and they're right next to each other, not getting decent sun, time to dig them up. As long as they grow well and they're flowering well, just leave them. They're not in a hurry for you to dig them up. You probably know that most of the spring bulbs are perennial. They come back year after year after year. But what about tulips? It seems as if many of the tulips don't come back very well, and even if they come back a second year, they don't bloom very well. You know, the first year you plant 12 bulbs, you get 12 beautiful flowers. Second year, you get 3 or 4 plants and maybe 1 blooms. Now, that's not you. That's not your soil. It's not your gardening habits. The problem with tulips is that they've been so inbred to make fancy flowers and big flowers that we've bred the perennialization out of them. They don't come back. Today's modern tulip hybrids are really one-year plants. They're not designed to bloom again. Now, if you want tulips that will come up year after year after year, look for the Darwin series. They're an older cultivar and they come back very reliably year after year. The other thing I tell people is find an old gardener who has some of these old cultivars. Every few years they have to dig them up and they have excess bulbs and they'll be happy to give you a couple. If you start with those, in a few years you'll have so many tulips you won't know what to do with them. The other alternative is to plant other types of bulbs that don't have this problem. Again, daffodils are a good choice. And in fact, most other bulbs are fine. It's mostly the tulips that have been inbred too much. When should you buy your bulbs? I mean, if you wait till late fall, they go on sale and you get a good deal. You know, bag for half price. In fact, what I've noticed the last few years is I go out in the springtime and stores suddenly have spring bulbs for sale. And they're really inexpensive then. Well, those bulbs are last year's bulbs. Don't buy them. In fact, with spring bulbs, it really is important to buy them as soon as stores have them. You want fresh bulbs because as they sit, they get older, they lose moisture, they start shriveling, they get smaller. They're not as healthy. Buy them early and plant them right away. Now, the suggestions for spring bulbs is that you should plant them in sunny areas. Spring bulbs don't grow in shade, or so they say. Well, that's really a myth for 2 reasons. The first reason is that there are some spring bulbs that grow just fine in shady or at least part shade areas. The bluebells, crocus, hyacinths, snowdrops, they all do quite well in a part shade area. The second reason most bulbs do well in a shady area is that even though you plant them under trees, and here we're talking deciduous trees, they come up early enough to catch sunlight before the leaves come out of the deciduous trees. And that's particularly true of early bulbs like crocus and snowdrops. When they're making leaves, they're under a big maple, but they're in a sunny spot because there's no leaves on the tree yet. So as far as the bulb is concerned, they're growing in sun. By the time the leaves come out and things get shady, they're ready to start going underground. And that's why many of the bulbs, particularly the smaller bulbs, do just fine in a shady area. Bulbs that bloom later in summer, things like some of the late daffodils and the later tulips, they don't do quite so well under a shady tree. And of course, under a shady evergreen tree, bulbs aren't going to do well. How about the black tulip? Does it exist? Well, not really. There is no such thing as a black tulip. You can get some very dark purple tulips, and they appear to be black, particularly in certain types of light. But there really is no such thing as a black tulip. I hope you understand spring bulbs better now. If you'd like to learn more about spring bulbs, I have a whole series of videos about them, how to plant them, how to take care of them, how to grow them inside. And you can get to all of those videos right here. Happy gardening.